And for those who enjoy this channel and would love to support us financially, please feel free to hit that donate link. We'd greatly appreciate it. God bless.
All right, so we are live, everyone. We're with Standing for Truth today, and we'll be talking about human evolution. We'll be talking about Standing's recent debate on modern day debate with a woman named Erica, and Standing. So I can make sure that your audio is loud enough. Can you just introduce yourself? Who are you, just in case there's someone who's not familiar?
Of course. Hey, Brother Guzman, thanks for having me on tonight. I run a channel, Standing for Truth, where I promote creation, promote the truth, obviously, debunk evolutionism. I mean, it's a false philosophy. So we try and take on the very best arguments and evidence that the evolutionists think that they have for their philosophy. So I've done, I think the Erica debate was roughly debate number 50. And I've debated the likes of like Erica, and I've had some good debates with Dr. Stephen Frello was one that comes to mind, Godless Engineer, RJ Downard. So I've definitely seen the best that they have to offer, and I enjoy refuting those arguments.
Amen. Amen. So, Standing, let's just talk about, because you recently recommended to me a book. What's that book called, and who was it written by?
So that book is a great question, Guzman. Contested Bones. It is a book written by Christopher Roop and then Dr. John Sanford. So Dr. John Sanford, as you know, wrote Genetic Entropy. And what he's done in this book is he's thoroughly investigated. He's even looked at all the primary sources. He's looked at all the so-called fossil evidence for human evolution. So he goes into, all the hominids. He goes into all the Australopithecines and thoroughly refutes them and goes over the claims made by the evolutionists in the paleoanthropology field. And he actually shows that there's a lot of contention in that field. It's like no two paleo experts can agree on everything, so there's a lot of confusion going on, and just kind of goes to show that the evidence for human evolution is really weak. It's dying at this point, really.
Right. And so, basically, it's just pointing out the contradictions between the scientists of this field of human evolution, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. They're, like, a lot of people might know Donald Johanson or Mary Leakey. They're known for a lot of the first finds regarding the Australopithecines, Australopithecus afarensis, Ray Lucy, for example. But what they don't tell you in textbooks, in school, in documentaries, was that there was a lot of contention regarding all these different bones, right? I mean, what they were discovering a lot of the times were human bones that they would attribute to the genus Homo, as well as a lot of ape bone that were clearly in the Australopithecus genus. And eventually Donald Johanson pretty much attributed all the bones to the Australopithecines. And you can see that, paleo expert Mary Leakey, for example, she disagreed with this. And these disagreements continue on up to today. And all their so-called best evidence for human evolution in the fossil record, all these so-called hominins, as pointed out by Dr. John Sanford in Contested Bones, fits perfect within a biblical framework.
Right. And so on the screen for everyone who's watching, I did a little setup. On the top we have 2 Timothy 2:15, and then here on the bottom for you guys it's going to be right here. The bottom right is the skull of Australopithecus afarensis. Lucy is the famous single specimen of Australopithecus afarensis. Did the book that you're referencing to ever mention? Did it handle Lucy? And if so, tell us what are the faults of Donald Johansson's work on Lucy.
Very good question, actually. Some of this stuff I did cover in my debate with Erica, and due to the constraints of time, obviously I couldn't cover it all. So there is a great deal wrong with Lucy, with the Australopithecus afarensis. And for one, the Australopithecines that you see purported by the evolutionists, saying that these are so-called human ancestors, most of them share their features with living apes today. And I pointed this out in the debate. They're around 3 to 4 feet tall. They've got the long arms, the short legs. Their hands are ape. Their feet, they've got long curved fingers. They've got the opposable thumb. They've got ape-shaped skulls, funnel-shaped rib cages, for example, and there's some uniqueness in their morphology, but it's best, these Australopithecines are best explained as just an extinct ape genus. And when you look at Lucy, for example, she was discovered, Guzman, in hundreds of pieces before what they did was they glued back together these pieces in a way that fit the evolutionist basic assumptions. So there's a lot of guesswork, inference, assumptions put into these pretty well just artistic interpretation of the bones. I mean, Lucy had locking wrists just like apes today and not humans. So yeah, these fragmentary bones that they're putting together, Guzman, and then they're reconstructing, they're often done based on these evolutionary assumptions, right? Like these paleo experts, they believe that Lucy walked upright, for one. They believe that Lucy and these Australopithecines are our ancient ancestors. Therefore, they're going to reconstruct them based off that primary assumption. So there's just so much wrong with it. A big one is the foramen magnum. And they need that to be in the same position, more or less, as humans, and Erica made this claim as well, in order to claim that Lucy walked upright. But the foramen magnum actually lies in much the same position as some apes today. And even if you account for size differences too, let's say, let's take a gorilla, for example, Guzman. A gorilla is a lot bigger than the so-called Australopithecus afarensis. But if you allow for these size differences, then the gorilla and Lucy's foramen magnum are nearly identical. So when they try and tell you that, there's so much evidence that she walked upright, that's not true. She was clearly tree dwelling, Guzman. I'm not sure if you know this, but there's evidence now based on the bones that we have, based on evidence for fractures, that she actually died falling out of a tree. And yet they don't want to tell us that she was a tree dweller. Actually, a lot of these paleo experts will say that she was a tree dweller and she spent a lot of time walking on land upright. So, I mean, there's just a lot of storytelling and imagination associated with it. I mean, these Australopithecines were nothing more than an extinct ape species.
Right, and so I heard this argument by Bill Ludlow, and if our audio sort of like falls apart, so guys, just make sure to tell me in the chat. I'm watching the chat right now.
How's the audio right now, they're saying?
It's the audio.
You good?
Yeah, I think we're good. We're good. So,
Good.
What was I saying? Oh, yeah. I watched the debate against Bill Ludlow's debate with Kent Hovind. I didn't watch the whole thing, but I watched half of it. And I saw a sort of convincing argument in the debate by Bill Ludlow, who, by the way, died last year. He knows better now. He's not an atheist anymore anyway. Bill Ludlow made this point that I thought was pretty convincing, that we have an almost complete skeleton of Lucy. Even though it's around 30-40% complete, all mammals are symmetrical. And so we have almost a full skeleton, and we can develop and figure out how what was sort of the lifestyle of Lucy through the bones. What would you say to someone who would make that argument or claim?
Yeah, they often do make that argument and claim. And it really is a fact that obviously since 1974, Guzman, when Lucy was originally found, and after they took these hundreds of pieces of bones and then glued them back together in a way, like I said earlier, that fits their basic assumption, right, of ape to man evolution. Well, since then, yeah, they have recovered more bones from other members of Lucy's species. But even though they've got a more complete collection and percentage of her bones, you can tell just looking at, let's say, her toes have been shown to curve like tree-dwelling apes. Her shoulders have been found to be nearly identical to living great apes today. Her wrists, for example, resemble those of other knuckle-walking ape species. And her hands are similar to those of chimpanzees. And another thing, too, that is kind of funny, you can even look it up on Google as well. I mean, the evolutionists have no problem admitting this. And I mentioned it to Eric in our debate as well, but a lot of these Australopithecine, they are a mixture of a lot of human bones and ape bones, kind of like Australopithecus sagiba, nothing more than an artificial species. Bill Ludlow likes to use that one as a prime example of a transitional form between apes and humans. But a lot of paleo experts today recognize that it is an artificial species, just like Homo habilis as well. With Bill Ludlow, once again, if you look through the presentation, praise that one as an example. But in regards to Lucy, the fact is a bamboo bone was incorrectly assigned to Lucy for Guzman over 40 years. So just like I said in my debate with Erica, that doesn't necessarily give me, much confidence regarding the evolutionists and their many other conclusions on human origins. And the thing is, they have such huge gaps. So even if you lay the Australopithecines aside, and like I've said earlier, they can easily be explained as just an extinct form of apes, because that's pretty well what the evidence suggests. And even if she had a more unique gait or a unique walk than, say, apes today and humans today, she definitely didn't walk like modern humans, that's for certain. But all their homonyms they look at in the Homo genus, right? Let's say Neanderthal, Erectus, Naledi, Homo naledi, that's one of the more praised examples because that was discovered recently. The hobbits as well, if you're familiar with those. Mm-hmm. As I went over in the debate, these are all prime examples of what happens in isolation, which leads to inbreeding, genetic damage, and these degenerate features. And as biblical creationists, what do we believe post-Babel? You've got these dispersions of different people groups, and unfortunately some, let's say the Neanderthal, for example, or Erectus, Naledi, they become isolated, right? Which results in inbreeding. And we know that exposes the hidden reservoir of genetic damage. It all comes down to genetic entropy. So the fossil record, Guzman, it's not evidence for forward evolution. It's just evidence for genetic degeneration. These were all members of our own species who underwent accelerated genetic damage due to severe and extended inbreeding. And as you know, it makes complete sense. Post-Babel, that's exactly what we would expect. So technically, they'll say Homo erectus evolved into modern Homo sapiens. And depending on, which model the evolutionists believe in, right, there's the out of Africa scenario, which we can touch on if you'd like, and the multi-regional scenario. They'll even say that Homo erectus evolved independently on other continents, Asia, Europe, Africa, for example, into some of their other so-called hominins. Homo heidelbergensis, for example, Ludlow likes to talk a lot about that. But we would say that modern humans devolved into these subpopulations, erectus, naledi, hobbits, due to genetic damage, which is opposite of what they believe, that Homo erectus, which is a degenerate form of Homo sapiens, evolved into Homo sapiens. So it's just the fossil record, Guzman, as you know, and as you stated many times in your debates, is evidence of extinction as a result of the fall.
Right, and many of the hominins, like you have brought up moments ago, can all be explained in the biblical model. When we have Babel splitting, when we have the dispersion since Babel, we have all this genetic diversity, and I believe that's called a bottleneck. Correct?
That's right.
All right, so
That's right.
we have a very low bottleneck since Noah's flood, only of 8 people. That's why there's so little diversity. That's why we all look very similar. And the different hominins, they all look similar to us, and that could all be explained by Babel and by the genetic diversity of inbreeding, etc., etc. So,
well, that's right. Yeah, like for example, like you were saying, the isolation, the inbreeding. That is exactly what gave rise to these abnormal or these atypical populations that people like Erica or Jackson Weed or Bill Ludlow like to point to, like the Neanderthals, Erectus, Hobbit, and Naledi. And those human variants, that's all they are. They're still all completely human. They lived in isolation post-Babel. And then given the situations associated with each of the variants that we're talking about, the specific environmental conditions, would lead to founder effects, isolation, and inbreeding. It's funny is every single feature that Bill Ludlow or Erica can point to is easily explained based on the genetic degeneration. For example, the small brains, the small bodies, these can be explained by island dwarfism, or in other words, reductive evolution. I mean, reduced brain sizes, you'll see, Guzman, if you watch Bill Ludlow's presentation and Erica's as well, they line up smaller brain to bigger brain in a sequence that suggests that one ape evolved into modern Homo sapiens, right? But there's now evidence that all these different hominids live together anyways, so there is no clear progression. Therefore, the unique features we see, they're best explained by pathology. And what's interesting is it's documented, Guzman, that every single one of these pathologies can be seen in modern humans today. So we're not just guessing. We have observational evidence. And the brains, the smaller brains that they point to, those can actually be beneficial in certain conditions, such as starvation. That's exactly what we'd expect given an isolated population such as this, post-Babel, because brains, Guzman, they're energetically costly. So all this suggests is evolution in reverse, and this reverse evolution and the pathologies associated with it can occur quickly in these isolated populations, as you stated earlier. And that's all in line with our biblical model, post-Babel, post-flood.
Right, and I'm writing down this question right now. I didn't know you were going to be finished like 5 seconds ago, but what is wrong with the bottleneck of a population of about 1,000? Because I heard that a few times in your debate with Erica, that like there was a bottleneck population of about 1,000 members. What's
Right.
sort of the problem with that? Why?
But that's a very good question. It's actually an argument that I bring up nearly every debate because it's an argument that can't be addressed. There's no rebuttal to it. So when we look at our species, every single human being on this planet is 99.9% similar. What that means is, as a human population, we have low genetic diversity. That kind of also brings us to the Y chromosome, for example, which every single male on this planet has a nearly identical Y chromosome, which proves that we all have and descend from one Y chromosomal ancestor, obviously Adam. And the same goes with mitochondrial DNA. All our mitochondrial DNA is extremely similar worldwide, suggesting we came from one mitochondrial DNA ancestor, which is obviously Eve. And we can get into all the details regarding mutation rates and coalescence, for example. But just using observed mutation rates, the empirical method, that actually takes us back to two ancestors, the mitochondrial DNA ancestor and a Y chromosomal ancestor, just 6,000 years ago. So the low genetic diversity, the variation in the Y chromosome and the variation in mitochondrial DNA fits perfectly within a biblical base model. So the evolutionists, though, like you pointed out, Guzman, they need to explain this data. So for one, they didn't predict this. They didn't expect this. So they invented a story. That story is called the Out of Africa Evolutionary Bottleneck Hypothesis, where some evolutionists, they'll say it might have, the human population at that time, 70,000 years ago, they'll say, dropped to about 2,000 individuals, maybe 10,000. That's usually what I'll ask, just to clarify. Either way, it's a huge problem because anybody knows that a small population will involve severe inbreeding. And not only that, is this so-called bottleneck, Guzman, it was an extended bottleneck. It was essentially a near extinction event. So they try and use this to explain why we have low genetic diversity, because they'll say, based on that prolonged bottleneck, that's how we lost all the genetic diversity, right? The problem is, though, is that's not even feasible, because it would cause permanent and severe genetic damage. And all that means is we'd be getting these deleterious mutations. Let's say a lot of them are recessive, right, from generation to generation. They would come to the forefront and they would go to fixation. So my question to the evolutionists is always, okay, if this so-called hypothesis is even remotely feasible, how could such a minute, completely extinct, and obviously genetically compromised population all of a sudden explode into all parts of the planet seizing dominion over the world? I mean, that's not even feasible. Now, yes, it may work to reduce overall human diversity like they want it to, but it's nothing but a post hoc evolutionary story. And what's funny, Guzman, is they always, like Erica, for example, pointed to the cheetahs. But the cheetahs actually support what we're saying as creationists. Because if you look at cheetahs today, and I just did a Google search yesterday because it's widely known there's about 10,000 cheetahs left in the world, Guzman. Just yesterday I checked, there's less than 7,000 in the world. And these cheetahs are showing serious signs of inbreeding and genetic decline. Do you think that this highly inbred population of cheetahs is suddenly going to explode in all parts of the planet, seizing dominion over the world like the so-called population bottleneck of Homo sapiens did? No, it's not. It's impossible. They're going extinct. All their genetic diversity is becoming eroded. The cheetahs are starting to express many destructive recessive mutations. Guzman, that's exactly what would have happened in their out of Africa scenario. The thing is, they can believe in it. all they want. It's a rescue device to explain the observable evidence. We don't need a rescue device. We believe God created two human beings, Adam and Eve. Therefore, what should we expect? Low genetic diversity. Every single human being should be incredibly similar if that story found in Genesis is true. And what do we find? We find just that, low genetic diversity. We don't need any mental invention. So they can go to the cheetahs, but that only shows more of what a fairy tale their hypothesis is. Does that make sense, Guzman?
Right, it definitely makes sense. So because there's so little genetic diversity amongst human beings, it has to limit the bottleneck size.
Exactly. So they would have to have a population bottleneck in order to reduce the human diversity. Because if you think about it, they believe we've been evolving for millions of years, right? So millions of years ago, humans and chimpanzees split from their common ancestor. Now, even before that, our so-called ape ancestors, let's say the Australopithecines, for example, they were also evolving. Therefore, there'd be a lot of mutations, there'd be a lot of diversity, there'd be a lot of genes floating around, a population of hundreds of thousands to millions strong for millions of years. Therefore, we shouldn't have this low genetic diversity. So they resort to 70,000 years ago, a major near extinction event, which almost wiped out the human population in order to explain the low genetic diversity. So it's pretty well sufficient evidence that, the account in Genesis is the empirical fact. But they're the ones that have to invent these stories. And what's funny, as I touched on briefly there, are Y chromosomes, which are passed on from father to son, unbroken, Guzman. I was saying how those are incredibly similar worldwide. This is exactly, for one, what we'd expect, given a biblical model of coming from Adam, right? So, of course, as you know, based on mutations, Guzman, once in a while, a mistake happens. And then every time that mistake happens, a new branch in our family tree is formed. Now, we can actually look, based on genomics, at all the branches in the world, and what do they go back to, Guzman? Well, they go back to a single person, not a chimpanzee, but a man. And based on the empirical method of mutation rates, this man lived just a few thousand years ago, who even the evolutionists admit is Y chromosome Adam. And that's the same thing with mitochondrial leave. Now, here's a point that I brought up against Erica, and she had no explanation, and she admitted it. They sequenced the chimpanzee Y chromosome. And it turns out the chimpanzee Y chromosome is only 70% similar to the human Y chromosome. They were shocked, Guzman. This is what they expected for a chicken and a human. But yet, a chimpanzee, our so-called most recent common ancestor, is only 70% similar to a human being. The Y chromosome should be the most similar, Guzman, and that's because the Y chromosome doesn't undergo recombination, so it's the most stable of chromosomes. The fact that it's 70% dissimilar pretty well makes ape-to-man evolution impossible, because how can that many genetic differences arise in only 6 million years according to their chimp-human common ancestor split?
Right, and if you think about it, if anyone thinks about it, if anyone knows what you're talking about, this is fatal to the theory of human evolution, because of the fact that, like you said, it's the human Y chromosome is very not open to change, and so if there's so much diversity amongst apes and humans, our Y chromosome, that just basically demolishes that we're related through common ancestry.
That's right. It demolishes their fairy tale, and that's why these evolutionists, they'll ask us to give them a line or a barrier to where humans and chimps are right? Because they'll look at genomic sequencing and genomic comparisons, and they can see that all humans are incredibly similar and related, and then they'll see that we also share some relationship in our genetics with chimpanzees, and therefore conclude, okay, well, obviously we're all related, and we must also be related to the chimps. And they're asking us, well, where's the line? Why can't we conclude such a thing if we can conclude it with humans? But that's the thing, when you look at differentiating evidence, because we can both explain similarities anatomically, morphologically, physiologically, genetically, through common design or common ancestor. Therefore, we need to look at something that can differentiate the explanations in the models. And something like the Y chromosome, it's too dissimilar. They have to invent yet another rescue device. That also goes back to genetic entropy. We accumulate 100 new mutations per person per generation. Now we know that the genome is incredibly functional, which makes the degeneration rate that much faster and that much worse. Therefore, the ape genome and the human genome are degenerating due to mutation accumulation. There's no way they could have been evolving for millions of years. So there's another line of evidence that we can look to differentiate between the models, right? They want to just look at mere similarities anatomically and genetically, but we want to look at a piece of evidence that can differentiate between the models and tell us which one is true and which one is pseudoscience, right?
Right. So where does Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve play into this?
Right, so very good question. So technically what they would believe is Homo erectus would have evolved a couple million years ago in Africa. Now, Homo erectus would have evolved into Homo sapiens probably about 200,000 years ago. Now, 70,000 years ago would have been the near extinction event where the human population was reduced to between 2 and 10,000. Now, they believe that two specific genotypes survived from that population, the Y chromosomal genotype and the mitochondrial DNA genotype. They believe this would have been about 70,000 years ago to 200,000 years ago. And these two genotypes would have migrated to all the different continents. This is actually not based, though, upon empirically observed mutation rates. They're pretty much making up a mutation rate that's like way too much higher than what we observe today. Because when we look at those human chromosomes, when we look at the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, and then just look at what the mutation rate is today, what it ticks at today, it's called a molecular clock, we can take that back in time to about 6,000 years ago to two ancestors, a Y chromosomal ancestor and a mitochondrial DNA ancestor. That's using the empirical method. We're using observable science to come to this date. But they justify their date, like I said, based on hypothetical, unrealistic mutation rates that are like 20 times off of what we actually observe. And then they justify this based on evolutionary assumptions, right? They assume that chimps and humans shared a common ancestor at some point, and then they treat that like it's an absolute fact. So they got to take all the data and then force fit it to support that that philosophy is what it is. So all we as creationists have to do is point to observable evidence to show the evolutionists that we came from a mitochondrial Eve and a Y chromosomal ancestor. That's Adam and Eve, as expected from the Bible. So, like you said, it is important, and I think as creationists, if we utilize that and then point out the fact that they're basing their conclusion off of unrealistic mutation rates, because you'll debate. Like, for example, I had a debate with, his name was Adam Friendon, on is there evidence for Adam, Eve, and Noah? And I pointed this out to him, and he went on Wikipedia and said, Wikipedia says mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam lived 200,000 years ago. The thing is, they can't take their evolutionary goggles off. How did they come up with that 200,000 year date? And then you look into how they came up with it, and you realize it's nothing more than pseudoscience.
Right, and I love it when he pulled up that Wikipedia page. It's like that time when I debated Gregory on faith alone salvation, and I asked him, how do you say I asked him how to say a phrase in Greek, and he looks it up on Google Translate.
Yeah, that's always a great way to corner somebody who wants to go back to a foreign language that they don't understand in order to prove something wrong in the Bible that is clearly understood in English. Just ask them to speak a specific word and see how quickly they flop. Like you did with Gregory. Yeah, you had to Google it.
Right.
Okay.
And so another question on mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome atom. This is where, like, a lot of the people who start listening to you, this is sort of where they get confused, because they hear you say, like, these were two literal people that were described in the book of Genesis. But then they hear you debate an atheist, and they say, well, it's not two literal people, and it's just like, what do they call it, and how do you refute that, and what's the evidence to say that it's two literal people?
Right, so good question. So technically, they believe that these are hypothetical ancestral genotypes that are based, all they're looking at is genetic patterns around the world. That's essentially the same thing that we're looking at. And they're trying to say that that endangered population bottleneck of Homo sapiens thousands and thousands of years ago, that these Adam and Eve, quote unquote, lineages are who recovered from that near extinction event and then very quickly spread throughout the world. So that's their story, and that's why, in debates, when I'm trying to tell them that we can look at the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA and see that both genetic compartments are incredibly similar, suggesting we all come from two ancestors, right? A mitochondrial Eve and a Y chromosome atom. So yeah, their rebuttal or their misunderstanding is due to their basic assumption that ape-to-man evolution is true, right? So technically the evidence does, suggest we came from two people. One Y ancestor, one mitochondrial DNA ancestor. And you can also point out the fact that our Y chromosome is 30% different than the chimp Y chromosome. I mean, there's two different kinds of animals right there. That indicates two separately created Y chromosomes.
All right, makes sense. So I'm just gonna cover two of the questions that were asked in the chat. Come on, guys, do a little bit better. Ask some more questions. Come on, don't leave me in the dark here. We only have two questions though, so I guess I'll just ask them now, and then we'll go back to the discussion. William Edward Hackman asked, "Is there such a thing as a Neanderthal?"
Good question. Yeah. There is such thing as a Neanderthal. All these fossils that we find of these, so-called human ancestors, whether it's the Neanderthal or the Homo heidelbergensis or Homo erectus or Homo habilis, Ergaster, Naledi, I mean, you can go on and on and on. They are real. But the evidence suggests, for example, if you want to look at the Neanderthals like he asked, all evidence, whether you look at genetics, because we do have their DNA sequence, paleontology, archaeology, they all sufficiently confirm that Neanderthals were in every way human. But like I said, due to isolation and inbreeding, and you can look in the evolutionist literature too, I think they believe the population of Neanderthals were maybe about 70,000. And I believe they say they were situated somewhere up in Europe. But yeah, a lot of their features that look abnormal to us today are easily explained due to accelerated genetic degeneration. Actually, in their genetics, you can see that they have a lot more diversity than us today. And that is actually evidence for this thesis, because they have more diversity because they would have experienced accelerated genetic degeneration. due to inbreeding and isolation. And actually, it's funny because a paper recently came out after this book, Contested Bones, was written. It's a paper you can find in the secular literature. Pulling it up right here if I can get it in time. Maybe not. Well, I'll send it to, was it Havier that asked the question?
It was William Edward Hackman.
Yeah. So this paper suggests that Neanderthals were 40% less fit than modern humans today. And what that means is this thesis of genetic degeneration associated with these so-called hominins has evidence backing it up. And in that paper, I believe it even says that severe genetic degeneration probably contributed to the disappearance of that population. And since I'm on that topic, are you familiar with Homo naledi, Guzman? I know both Erica and Bill Ludlow spent a lot of time on Homo naledi.
I'm familiar with all the names of the hominids, but I don't spend enough time researching every single one of them. But go ahead.
Right, yeah. And you know, it's one of those things where the evolutionists will try and bombard you with all these different fancy names, all these different hominin bones.
It's all Latin. It killed the Romans, and now it's killing us.
Exactly. They try and, they'll try and overwhelm you, when in fact, these names that I'm saying, right, Naledi, Neanderthal, Erectus, the Hobbits, which is actually, I think their Latin name is Floresiensis, but, and they call them Hobbits because they're really, really small people. But yeah, they'll try and bombard you with all these different names to confuse you, when in fact they're all just variants of the same human species. But Naledi was one of the most recent find, and Naledi does have some oddball features that the evolutionists like to point out. They've got curved fingers, for example, small body size. Their brains are smaller, for example. But yeah, all this evidence just suggests that they were also likewise inbred, and then suffered from that reductive evolution that I was talking about, which results in exactly those same features that the evolutionists want to point to and say are primitive. They're not primitive. They are the result of degeneration. It's just a fact. Reduced body size, reduced brain volume, all these other pathologies that they point to are better explained that way. And in my debate with Erica Guzman, I presented a paper of an evolutionist, actually, who studied a lot of these hominin bones, and he concluded an abundance of developmental anomalies and abnormalities in these hominids, and he was confused because all of these amount of bone distorting genetic pathologies, these enormous skulls, just so many deformities relating to dwarfism and reductive evolution. He was confused how there could be so much, and he even concluded that those populations were definitely undergoing genetic degeneration due to inbreeding. But what's funny, he's an evolutionist, he's a paleo expert, he can't come to the same conclusion as us. We sit back, relax, and say that's exactly what we've been saying. Post-Babel, you've got, modern humans going one way and flourishing, and then unfortunately you got these few subpopulations that go in the wrong direction. They get isolated on some specific islands or somewhere up in Europe or Asia, resulting in inbreeding, isolation, and genetic degeneration. So if you think about it, if those few subpopulations of humans would have just went, into spots on the earth, that wouldn't have resulted in those. Maybe there wouldn't be all this confusion. But, here we are arguing with the evolutionists about these features, which, like I said, are better explained under a biblical worldview. And I wanted to debate Bill Ludlow on this for a long time, and it never happened, but Erica seems to be their new hero, so I'm really glad that I got the chance to debate her on it.
Right. For a while, it was sort of like Bill Ludlow's their huge prophet of the ages, and now he's gone, and Erica took over. So
Yeah, exactly. They need their human evolution.
now it's the prophetess.
Yeah, exactly. Now it's a prophetess. And you know what? It was a respectful debate. I've got, she wasn't militant
She
by any
wasn't
means,
rude
but
in a way.
she wasn't rude or.
She wasn't like those atheists like Aaron Raw where you get on a live stream and they start doing a cursing party or cussing party or something, slaying words everywhere.
That's right. That's right. It was a respectful debate, but even for the audience sake too, human evolution. There's so many fatal blows, and even if you look at some of these evolutionists like Aaron Raw, Erica Jackson, they're gonna try and point to the very best evidence that they think is the best evidence for human evolution. As you know, Guzman, chromosome 2 fusion. They'll look at genetic mistakes apparently that we share with the great apes. They call those pseudogenes. They'll look to endogenous retroviruses, ancient viral infections apparently that have been passed down to humans and apes. But don't let these things intimidate you. All of these things have been overturned, and they all fall in line with the one same theme: junk DNA. They assume mistakes, they assume evolutionary leftovers, they assume genomic fossils. For example, Guzman, like the vestigial organ argument, right? These broken organs that have, are still retained by us, they believe the exact same thing in our genetics with these genetic mistakes. But all the research coming out with ENCODE and just accumulating papers every day suggesting that a lot of these, like endogenous retroviruses, for example, or the chromosome 2 fusion, which is spanned by a functional gene, these endogenous retroviruses are functional, which should lead us to ask the question, are these actual remnants of ancient viral infections? Because if these ERVs have these crucial functions, especially crucial functions, Guzman, in our placenta, in our embryo, well, how do the evolutionists explain that? So these DNA elements are exactly what we predict if God created Adam and Eve and the created kinds. I mean, when an engineer builds a car, does he build it with 80% junk? Of course not. So why would we expect our human genome to be littered with junk and parasites and remnants of ancient viruses? It just doesn't make any sense. So our prediction of a fully functional genome is coming true, and that truth overturns nearly all of their so-called best evidence.
Right. And there's only like 2 more questions from the chat, so I guess I'll just cover these 2 real quickly. First I'll ask Javier Ramos's question. This will probably be an easy one for you. Can genetic diversity and the creation model coexist? Can they prove each other?
Can you ask that again, Guzman? Can low genetic diversity...
Can genetic diversity, like genetic diversity in general, and the creation model coexist?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the main question is, and it's the same question that I asked Erica in the debate, is how do we explain the origin of genetic diversity? Because the evolutionists, they explain the origin of genetic diversity, all of genetic diversity, as the result of mutations. That's a basic assumption that they live by. Us, on the other hand, we explain the origin of genetic diversity as created diversity, right? We have 6 billion letters in our genome. I pass on 3 billion letters. My wife would pass on 3 billion letters. These recombine, they lead to change, they lead to variation. They believe, the evolutionists, that all these DNA differences are the result of mutation over time. And that's why they ask the question, how can we get all these species in only 4,000 years? Because, if if we explain the diversity as mutation as well, it would take a long time. But we explain them as created DNA differences. So diversity fits perfectly in our model because we see that these DNA differences, this diversity, is vastly functional, which is exactly what we'd expect if God created Adam and Eve and the created kinds with pre-existing functional, which is the key word, diversity. And that can explain, actually, Guzman, that can explain all the millions of species we see today in just a few thousand years since the flood, because that means unlimited variability in the genome.
So then a little add-on to that question. So then let's just say there was a really high genetic diversity amongst Homo sapiens sapiens, would that be a problem for creation, young Earth creation?
So if we had a high genetic diversity, so we weren't 99.9% similar?
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be...
Potentially.
It's not the case that we see, but that could... Like, for example, the Neanderthals and the African peoples, actually, do have a higher genetic diversity than the rest of the world. Now, we're still all 99.9% similar. As a matter of fact, the Neanderthals are 99.7% similar to us. So the evolutionists will try and say that that puts them outside of the human range, but it actually fits nicely in the human range. But we explain that extra percentage or couple percentage difference in diversity as a result of accelerated mutation. And I mean, I pointed out that paper earlier that proves that explanation to be true. But yeah, if there was too much diversity, it would be something we'd have to discuss, because if God created Adam and Eve, that actually brings me to another point regarding that. We do see higher levels of genetic diversity in animals. So it actually appears that God gave animals a greater ability to diversify and vary than he gave to humans. And the evolutionists will often look to that as a refutation of what I'm talking about here. But it makes sense, because if God created populations of these kinds of animals, because sometimes I feel like people have this misconception that God created only 2 dogs or 2 fish. You know, that's false. God created
A large
populations of animals. Well, that means there's a lot of genes floating around. We would expect higher diversity in animals, lower diversity in humans, because God only created 2 humans, Adam and Eve. And lo and behold, that's exactly what we see.
So at that point of creation, when he creates all these different populations, that little teeny tiny change in the genetic code within each animal of that population would drastically change what incidentally lead to a larger genetic diversity.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because there's processes other than genetic mutation that can lead to variation, right? Like, for example, what's called genetic recombination or genetic gene conversion, for example. It's kind of like if you picture, having a deck of cards, 52 cards, and you shuffle them. And every time you get a new variety of that 52 cards found in that deck, right? But the deck of cards itself always remains the same, but there's essentially unlimited diversity. So yeah, if these millions and millions of DNA differences that we have within our genetics are created DNA differences, like you said, Guzman, in one generation, just from shuffling around those DNA differences, can lead to new species nearly right away. Rapid speciation. So, and then that's exactly what we would predict. I mean, we can see how many dog breeds that we've created just through the manipulation of these DNA differences, right? Artificial selection, or horse breeds. Hundreds and hundreds of horse breeds we've done the same thing with. If you actually look at the species and not the breeds, there's only a handful of horse species, and there's only a handful of dog species, right? Wolves, coyotes, for example. So isn't it funny that the evolutionists want to explain just these handful of, let's say, horse species over millions of years, yet in just human time, we've essentially led to hundreds of horse breeds because that genetic variability is already built in. So, we have observable evidence in real time with breeds to support our hypothesis that God created Adam and Eve and the created kinds with genetic diversity. So, yeah, you're absolutely right there, Guzman.
All right, so this is like the last question in the chat, unless all of a sudden somebody asks another one. But Rain, Reign, Rain asks, do you believe dinosaurs went after hunted humans like in Jurassic Park?
Do I believe that dinosaurs hunted humans like in Jurassic Park?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I believe dinosaurs were actually just dragons. The word dinosaur, as you know, Guzman, I mean, you're brilliant regarding this topic. The word dinosaur wasn't invented until 1841. Dinosaurs were brought onto the ark. They came off the ark. And over time, it's probably quite the opposite. Humans hunted these dinosaurs. Nobody wants a dinosaur living in their backyard, right? There's a lot of human civilizations today that don't have any more bears living around them. That's because the bears were hunted. Nobody wants to live next to a bear or a dragon. And you see legends upon legends upon legends of dragons, right? The hero saves the prince and kills the dragon. So yeah, no, quite the opposite actually. It sounds like humans led the dinosaurs to extinction, as well as environmental changes post-flood. Some of these dinosaurs that grew to immense sizes, like the Apatosaurus, for example, I believe had nostrils the size of a modern-day horse. So something like that couldn't grow to the same size as it did in the pre-flood world. In the post-flood world, of course. So, but I mean, we still see stories all over Africa and the Congo and all these lake monsters that suggest some of these, dinosaurs are still alive today. But yeah, good question.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that point, and I would also agree that dinosaurs did probably occasionally hunt humans. We see in the story of Leviathan in Job 41 where it says that will he show mercy unto thee? Like, remember the battle, do no more. Obviously, God's telling Job about like a huge battle with it's just basically a story like a fisherman. Let's say he draws up Leviathan, and here he comes, and like he's gonna start eating him because he woke him up. But we also see, okay, let's talk about, I'd just like to cover a few of the things that you mentioned. Like the Meconium bembe, the Congo dragon, that's actually an herbivorous dinosaur, and a lot of the dinosaurs that have been hunted, I've found a common connection that they're all herbivorous dinosaurs. I don't think anyone would have the guts to go to hunt a pack of raptors, because or a Tyrannosaurus Rex, or anything of that magnitude, or anything that's carnivorous, because they were probably just so successful that nobody would want to be close to them, and dinosaurs probably did hunt these humans at that time, because we have also legends. We have legends of people killing humans, but we also have legends of dinosaurs killing. We have legends of humans killing dinosaurs and dinosaurs killing humans. So I think I'd have to say both. We hunted dinosaurs and dinosaurs hunted us. But then once we killed off all their main prey, like the sauropods that you mentioned, they sort of died out.
Right. Yeah. No, I would agree. Actually, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it would go both ways, and the reason why a lot of these humans probably had to hunt these carnivorous dinosaurs to extinction was because the dinosaurs in turn were doing the same to the humans. So yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I would say it goes both ways as well. That's a good answer, Guzman.
It's like asking, well, let's just say 100 years from now, great white sharks go extinct. It's like saying, well, did great white sharks hunt humans? Yes, sometimes, but we also hunted them. So it's sort of that sort of scenario.
Right, that's a good point. And I think it all goes back to the point that, yeah, sometimes a lot of these evolutionists and atheists, they'll scoff at us by using dinosaurs. And as you can see here, just from your explanation, in just a few minutes, that dinosaurs fit perfectly well in the Bible. And you hear stories of dinosaurs in the Bible as well, like we said, Leviathan, Behemoth, tail like a cedar, for example. And I've heard all the rescue devices for that coming from the secularists or the old earth creationists. But point is, the evidence fits perfectly well, given a biblical-based model. So yeah, that's a very good point, Guzman.
Thank you. And just to go on sort of a short little rabbit trail, they would like to say that Behemoth was a rhino, right? I'm pretty sure you've heard that plenty of times, right? Rhinoceros, rhino. But the thing is that they say that Behemoth is a rhino because he has his nose pierced through snares, cuts, whatever. But then they also say that unicorns are rhinoceroses. Which one is it? Because in Job 40 we have Behemoth. Job 41 we have Leviathan. But in Job 39 we have unicorn. We have the unicorn and the eagle. And so, if it has to be one or the other, because God's not going to give two different names to this when he's referencing the same thing. Because he's just not being repetitive in this certain scenario with Job. And if the unicorn is a rhinoceros, then Behemoth is a sauropod. And if Behemoth is a rhinoceros, then the unicorn is a triceratops, or whatever you want to call it. So, just a short little rabbit trail there. I love talking about this stuff, but brother, we're on almost 10:15. You did say you wanted to go for an hour. We've probably went a little bit over time. Do you think you'd want to have a few more minutes talking, or do you want to give your final thoughts? Or?
Yeah, no, I think for final thoughts, I would say that if there are any other questions, because in only an hour we can only cover so much. I think we covered quite a bit actually. If there are any lines of evidence that anybody in the audience comes across, let's say chatting with an evolutionist, and they're looking for an answer regarding it, whether it's in genetics or the fossil record, for example, or one of these so-called hominins that maybe we didn't touch on, they can either go through you and then you can ask me, or they can email me, or even just comment on my channel. And I'm always free to answer questions, as I'm sure you are as well, Guzman. And it'll be my goal to answer any questions that anybody may have on any topic, not just human evolution, but any topic really. So I had a lot of fun tonight, Guzman. The hour flew by. I think we covered a lot of good stuff, and I hope the audience had fun.
Amen, and I really appreciate the audience for listening. We had, at most, I think we had 10 or 11 people watching, so I haven't been live streaming in a while, so it's sort of a little hard to get back my listeners, because sometimes I would get on a stream and I'd get like maybe 20 people watching, but since I haven't been doing some in a while and I've been doing a lot of tests, I haven't been getting a lot. But the conversation with Nephilim Free, I think he has like 200.
That was a good conversation. I enjoyed that.
Thank you, and I appreciate Neff for coming on. He and I disagree on a few things, but not gonna split hairs.
Right, we can at least come together on this issue.
Right, and I'd like to have Ramat come and join me on for a conversation as well. I have Ramat's email, so I'll probably ask him to join. But if there was any technical difficulties, they should all be resolved, and I'll probably re-upload this conversation if I find too many issues with it, because I did record it on the side. So, so those were your final thoughts?
Yeah, and like I said, anyone has any other questions, please let me know. I can upload this to my channel as well. It'd be good to get this video out to as many people as possible, just to show them that they can have confidence in the Bible and in science, because they are consistent, perfectly consistent, and not contradictory. So we don't need to look to biblical compromises like theistic evolution or older creationism, because we can make assumptions based on a biblical starting point, and we can make scientific predictions and retrodictions and see that they come true over and over and over again. And I always say a bone found in the dirt, or a rock that these evolutionists want to use to date, those are not what are inherited. Genetics are what are inherited. And that would be the best way and the best place to look at the origin of species, to look at our ancestry, and all things genetics points right back to biblical creation.
Amen, and I would very much appreciate you re-uploading this, because it's a lot of great info, and I certainly don't mind. There's no copyright infringement on this. It's all under free use anyway. But the viewer may be watching this and they're like, what? All this, I don't really get this. They might be thinking to themselves, like, what's he trying to say here? But the point that we're trying to make here is that just the fact of genetic entropy alone, I don't think we covered it too much on here. We should definitely do this again and cover that topic as well. But genetic entropy should just give you, should just get your hair stand up on your neck, because it's all pointing towards constant destruction, and that we're only limited by so much time genetically, that Jesus Christ is going to have to come back before then, because then we'll all be extinct by the time 200,000 years come by. But this all points towards the Bible. If you're not 100% sure that you're going to heaven, I encourage you to check out the video. I'm going to post it in the description. The Bible Way to Heaven by Pastor Jonathan Shelley. And so it's a 10-minute long video that goes through everything you need to know to be saved. So I want to thank Brother Standing for Truth for joining me tonight. Standing, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it, and especially on such short notice. We literally planned this in just 2 days ago, so just really short notice to come on. Since Dr. Hovind couldn't come on today, I really appreciate you coming on, and pray for Matt, guys. He's not feeling really good. He's feeling pretty sick right now, so he wasn't able to join me yesterday. But thanks, Standing. I'll let you go now. Probably stay here for a few more minutes. But thanks, Standing, for coming on. God bless.
God bless, brother. Amen. Thanks for having me on, Guzman.
All right. Thank you.
For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button, because we are just getting started.